Thank you for tuning in to On the Brink. I'm Rosemary Armeo, your host, and I want to talk today about dying, specifically help in dying. And we're going to be speaking with Corinne Carey. She is from Troy, New York. Corinne is a lawyer, an organizer, and a policy strategist. She's working now for a group called Compassionate Choices. We'll be talking about that. Formerly, she was with the New York Civil Liberties Union. Her MO is to take on big, major public health initiatives. She uses sound evidence, she uses human rights principles, and she gets some changes made, which is amazing. She worked on abortion, and she did that long before Roe v. Wade looked to be in danger of repeal. That was prescient. And for some time now, her mission has been to improve the care and to give more options to people who are dying, who are looking at their own end. It's been wildly controversial. And there's been a big change this year. I didn't think I would ever see this in New York, but we appear to be on the verge of passing a medical aid to dying bill. How'd you bring that about, Corinne?
Well, I kind of want to say we're on the brink, Rosemary, right?
We are.
We are. Well, it's been a decade of really, really hard work, intensive conversations about something that no one really wants to talk about. And we've experienced a lot of loss along the way. We've lost 28 advocates who've walked the hallways in Albany talking to lawmakers about this, pleading for this option, and many of them died suffering. So a lot of work, a lot of suffering. And we are at the point now where the Senate needs to take up this bill and pass it before they leave in June.
And you do expect that to happen. It has passed the assembly. Governor Hochul has signaled that she will sign it. So the last barrier is a Senate vote.
Well, I don't think that the governor has taken a public position on this. I think many of us who have worked with her in the past and have seen how she operates feel hopeful about that. But there's a tremendous amount of lobbying happening from the opposition to this bill. And so I'm really hopeful that lawmakers can stand strong with, more than 60 civil society organizations that have taken a position in favor of this. Stand with the 72% of New Yorkers who
Mhm.
think that dying people should have this option. I mean, you mentioned that it was a controversial bill, and I think no one could dispute that, but um,
Mhm.
the numbers seem to indicate that it's not so controversial with voters.
Yeah, I have compared this to what happened in New York with marriage equality. At one point, that was just considered a depraved idea. Nobody would touch it with a 10-foot pole in the legislature. And it wasn't overnight. I understand that. But it seemed that suddenly the sea parted. There was a change in thinking, a change in attitude, and those laws passed in New York. And we seem to be similarly to that on the brink. Again, I'll use my logo on the brink of a change of heart about how we handle death.
Yeah, I think for people who watch Albany, it's been described as a very undemocratic state legislature with a lot of the work happening behind the scenes. You don't see too many public hearings, for example.
Mhm.
There were public hearings on medical aid and dying in 2018, which some people like to forget happened, where we had, more than 100 people, both for and against the bill, testifying before the Assembly Health Committee. But the work in New York is largely invisible. It's
Mhm.
a lot of plotting, district by district, person by person, having heartfelt conversations. There were many times when I was grateful that I have social work training because I would sit in front of lawmakers who shared with me some of the most painful things that they've ever experienced, the death of a loved one, and had never really had an outlet to talk about it. So this bill has really brought to the fore some really deep emotions from lawmakers.
It's amazing. Journalists always reduce this to one expression. It's an emotionally charged issue. Doesn't begin to plummet. It's a personal interest to me. I think most of my listeners know this. My mother's almost 100. She's very, very impaired physically now, and she has dementia. She would hate what she is now. She always told us she didn't want to linger, didn't want to be a burden. And in fact, this law would not impact her at all. Dementia is not affected. We'll talk about that in a minute, but she's always been in support of what she called, Corinne, euthanasia. It also was called physician-assisted suicide. And let's start with talking about words because we don't call it that anymore. Your bill is medical aid in dying for the terminally ill. That's a lot different, both in the wordage itself and in the act. It's the person is doing it to and for themselves, it's not the doctor's action anymore. Can you talk a little bit about that? It's a conscious change in terminology.
Yeah, I think it's really important for your listeners to understand that physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia are two loaded terms that the opposition uses to describe this bill. Death with dignity is a term that advocates have often used, but shortly after taking on this campaign in New York, I decided that we shouldn't call it death with dignity here in New York because I have my own personal experience. My father, strong Irish Catholic Marine, died with dignity. Does that mean that he used medical aid in dying? No, it means that he died the way that was consistent with what he wanted, how he lived his life. He died at home with a sufficient amount of pain for him to feel like he suffered in the way that he was supposed to as a Catholic, and he died with his family around him, and and that was dignity to my dad. Thankfully for us, he didn't suffer for long. From diagnosis to his death was only 6 months, but um, that the suffering that he endured was something that he wanted. And that is a dignified death. So yeah, we call this bill the Medical Aid in Dying Act because that is what it is. It's unadorned. It's not an advocacy term, and it is about allowing a patient with 6 months or less to live, dying of a terminal illness, which is incurable and irreversible, to ask their doctor for a prescription that they can take to die peacefully on their own terms. That's what this is. It's giving people an option to do that.
Your description now is beginning to get into the many safety, all the precautions in this bill to make sure there is no abuse. So, can you go into that a little bit more? There are witnesses, there are checks and balances here. Talk about that.
Sure. So the bill has more than a dozen safeguards, and they are modeled after Oregon's Death with Dignity law, which passed by voter referendum in 1994. Now, Oregon was the first state that had ever legalized medical aid in dying in this country. And so you'd expect that when a state steps out and does something for the first time, that they would have to go back and fix it, amend it, tinker, make sure it works right. And in fact, the safeguards that Oregon adopted over 30 years ago, are the same as what New York's law allows now. Two witnesses have to witness a person's written request. The person has to first make an oral request. Two doctors have to confirm both the terminal illness and that the person has 6 months or less to live. Both doctors have to be satisfied that the person is mentally capable of making this decision. And if either doctor has any doubt about that, they need to refer the person for a mental health evaluation.
Mhm.
Um, you
I,
know,
I
like
believe the witnesses cannot be related to the patient. Isn't that right?
That's right. There's a whole list of factors that impact who can be a witness. Can't be the doctor, can't be either of the doctors. It can't be anyone who has a financial stake in the person's estate. It can't be a healthcare proxy. It can't be a domestic partner. So yes, New York safeguards are in that regard a little bit stronger than some of the other states that have passed medical aid and dying laws. We've also in New York added language to the bill that makes 100% certain that health insurance companies cannot condition paying for life-saving treatment on whether the person does or does not ask for medical aid in dying. That was a concern that opponents
Oh. That's
Right.
interesting.
It is interesting. And, for a long time, opponents have said, well, insurance companies will just deny people coverage for
Mhm.
care, in lieu of medical aid in dying. Well, not only have we strengthened the bill, but sometimes I wonder whether these opponents have health insurance, because you and I both know that people are denied coverage for care that they need every single
Mhm.
day. Your insurance companies don't need medical aid in dying as an excuse to do that. They're doing it now.
Hmm. Wow, that's fascinating. I hadn't thought of that aspect of it. You do mention though that Oregon's law is 25 years old, and there are also 10 other states right now, plus the District of Columbia, that have laws similar to what we're talking about in New York. In all of that time, in all of those places, is there any record of abuse or insurance fraud or people trying to get money from their loved ones by offing them, any of those things about which there have been worries? Has there been any of that that you're aware of?
No, Rosemary, and these laws have been under a microscope for this entire time. We have opponents that are extremely well funded, and if there had been any hint of a problem with these laws, you best believe that it would be broadcast far and wide to New
Right.
York lawmakers, and there has not been a single case of abuse. That's
Uh,
why these laws are so carefully constructed, and the safeguards are so strong that one of the only complaints that the group Disability Rights Oregon, which is a watchdog group for people living with disabilities in that state, one thing that they said the last time they certified that there had been no complaints is that the only complaints they had received were from people living with disabilities who wanted to avail themselves of this law but were unable to because the safeguards were so strong.
right. And that's the same sort of complaints that you're going to face here in New York too, that people with dementia, but they've waited too long, or people with serious illnesses that are on the verge of, but not exactly terminal, they cannot do this.
Right,
So
or people who are unable to or lose the ability to self-ingest the medication.
exactly,
Right.
exactly. Yeah, you
Yeah.
can't do it either. I was going to ask if there was a model law that that states now that we have 10 other states we're following, but it might be that New York may be that law.
Well, I think that the New York law is the best law out there. Once it passes, it will be the strongest. But all of the laws are modeled after Oregon's law just because it's worked so well. You mentioned at the top of the show that I worked for the New York Civil Liberties Union, so I do consider myself someone who works hard to ensure disability rights. And so when I thought about taking this job, one of the first things that I did is I read. New York State's Task Force on Life and the Laws report from 1994. They were looking at whether New York should adopt what they called at that time an assisted suicide law. And I read that report, and it was frightening. The fears that task force raised about abuses of vulnerable populations, flaws in the healthcare system that could lead to misuse of medical aid in dying. And so I did my research, and I
Mhm.
looked at all of the state reports that had been issued describing how these laws were used in Oregon, in Vermont, in Washington. And I satisfied myself at that time that the laws were carefully constructed enough to protect vulnerable populations. Well, fast forward, you know,
Mhm.
and we're seeing the same exact arguments by
Mhm.
opponents that were made in 1994 before any state in this country had ever passed and implemented a medical aid and dying law. So none of these arguments are new. They may have been valid before these laws took effect, but we certainly know now. We don't have to guess at what's going to happen. Right now, what we're looking at is hypothetical fears that have never panned out in any state that has adopted this against very real harm that dying people and their families are experiencing without this option.
You're listening to On the Brink, and our guest today is Corinne Carey, who is an advocate, a lawyer, and a specialist on big health issues, who has been instrumental in bringing to New York a bill that would make it easier for people to control their own end of life. Corinne, we've been talking about opponents. They're strong and they're well-funded and they're powerful and they're going after the bill. Who are they? Religious leaders must be among them. Advocates for the disabled who fear that their vulnerable clientele will be somehow hurt by these laws. Talk about them and anybody else who has come out against this kind of law.
Yeah, there are really only three types of groups that are opposed to this law. I'm part of a coalition of more than 60 groups, including the Medical Society, the Nurses Union, the League of Women Voters, again, the New York Civil Liberties Union, the statewide Senior Action Council. More than 60 groups have signed on in support. There are about 12 groups in opposition to this bill, and they fall into three categories. One, right to life groups. Two, Catholic groups led by the New York State Catholic Conference, and a handful of disability rights organizations. So it is not the entire disability rights community. In fact, polling shows that people living with disabilities support medical aid in dying in the same measure as the general public. Why? Because medical aid in dying guarantees self-determination, individual decision making, autonomy. These are things that
Right.
living with disabilities have fought for years. And what I would say about the opponents, I can understand if someone has a moral problem with these laws, if they feel like it might be their duty from a religious perspective to oppose these laws. What I find troubling is when people lie about the facts. And one thing that I've noticed is that some leaders in the disability rights community have gone so far as to say when this law passes, there will be a bullseye on the back of people living with disabilities.
Oh, wow.
That doesn't bother me because I think that it will defeat our effort to pass this law. What bothers me the most is that when this law passes, there are going to be terrified people all across the state feeling like their lives are in jeopardy. I find that disgraceful and deeply disturbing that people would want to terrify an entire community of vulnerable people when they know that this is not how these laws have panned out in other states. It's
Absolutely.
irresponsible.
You also worked on a similar law in New Jersey that went into effect, what, 2019? Was that experience different, or did you have the same opposition, the same arguments, the same process that you faced here in New York?
Well, New York's legislative process is a lot more difficult to navigate than in New Jersey, but the opposition, it was the exact same arguments. It's been the exact same arguments since the early 1990s in every single state that we've worked in to expand end of life options. Religious arguments, right to life arguments, and fears about how these laws will affect people living with disabilities. And I will say that, now we've got more than 5 years of experience with how this has worked in New Jersey, and none of the harms predicted by
Wow.
opponents have come to pass in that state.
Yeah, as I say, I did research, of course, coming into this, and I thought I had left out something or not looked in the right place because I can't find negatives other than, as you call them, hypothetical worries.
Yeah.
Yeah. Have any other states, or could it happen here, that the law would be expanded to include those people you talked about who wish that they could partake of its benefits but are not allowed to? Has that happened elsewhere? Could it happen here?
It has not. The core eligibility guidelines for medical aid in dying have never once been expanded since that first law was passed in 1994. There have been some amendments to some of the laws. I'll give you an example. Some of the states looked at their 15-day waiting periods and
Mhm.
said that not only are they superfluous because it takes longer than 15 days for people to find a consulting physician,
Right.
it takes longer to get through the process than it does sitting through the waiting period. And so what they were finding is people spent months looking for a consulting physician who would be willing to participate. And and then the waiting period started. And
Wow.
And
Yeah.
people were dying before they had the ability to avail themselves of medical aid in dying. So those states, some of those states have passed amendments to their laws that allow the waiting period to be waived in certain circumstances if the doctor thinks that the person will not survive the 15-day waiting period. Another change has been to lift the residency requirement, and I think some of the opponents, point to this as a smoking gun. See, look, it's a slippery slope. These laws are being changed. The residency requirement, from our perspective at Compassion and Choices, is unconstitutional. It is it's the only type of healthcare that has a residency requirement in order for you to get care. So what does that mean? We have people sitting in waiting rooms in New Jersey getting health care across the border. They go home to their apartments in Manhattan without the peace of mind knowing that they have this option. Other people go home in New Jersey and know that they have this option. There is no other medical care that has that kind of a
Wow.
residency requirement. And so states have been lifting them. And New York doesn't have one because we know it's unconstitutional. But those are the kinds of changes that have been made around the margins. Never has there been an expansion in who
Mhm.
is eligible for medical aid in dying.
That's interesting. Okay, a couple other questions come to mind. One is, I think abortion might also be a healthcare option that has residency requirements now.
No, they operate differently. It is not that a woman can't cross a state line and get an abortion. There have been some protections put in place in places like New York and New Jersey to protect physicians who provide
Right.
this care. So that's the difference between abortion and medical aid in dying.
Aha, interesting. Okay. And is there any indication that there will be a shortage of doctors in New York in this area who would be unwilling to participate, maybe for some of the same reasons that legislators opposed passing this bill up to now?
It's a good question, and it's important for everyone to understand that this law, once it passes, is entirely voluntary for everyone, the patient, the doctor, a hospice
Wow.
facility, a pharmacist. And so, yes, indeed, when these laws pass, it is not easy to find a doctor who is willing to participate. Not only are doctors nervous about doing this the first time, and often they need a mentor who's done it in another state to help guide them
Wow.
through the process. There certainly will be physicians here who are comfortable and willing. We've been working with the New York State Academy of Family Physicians they have already started putting in place training for physicians. But yeah, it is going to be a challenge because
Wow.
um, doctors are not eager to do this. But it's very important that the law be voluntary for everyone.
Okay. It's expensive to do this, I take it.
It can be. I mean, there are insurance companies that cover the cost of medical aid in dying. They don't advertise that they do. Just like with many services, it's up to the insured to find out whether certain types of care are covered. But the medication can cost, with all of the attendant costs, up to about $600. So um, it's not inexpensive, but many insurance companies do cover it.
We did cover it. And do you have any indication of the numbers of people that we're talking about who would avail themselves of this?
It is less than 1% of people who die in authorized jurisdictions that take advantage of medical aid in dying. So the numbers are incredibly small. But what we know is that many, many more people gain tremendous peace of mind knowing that the option is available should
Mhm.
their suffering be too
Ah, it's
great.
the idea of choices again.
It is. It
Yeah.
is.
So you worked with abortion law before you moved into end of life issues. Do you see similarities there in both the opposition and the issues and how you persuade people to a different point of view?
Yeah, it is an interesting vantage point that I have because we started trying to codify Roe versus Wade into New York statute um, 13 years before Roe versus Wade was overturned, and Democratic lawmakers thought we were out of our minds. They thought there's no way that Roe is going to be overturned. Abortion is not in jeopardy in New York. And so it took years and years and years of meeting with even the Democrats to get them to understand that this is something that was important to codify in New York law. And yeah, the opponents are the same.
Hmm.
in both issues.
Definitely pressure, definitely pressure. So it'd be so had you been working at the federal level, we'd be in a whole different situation right now with abortion law. This may be premature because it's not a done deal yet in New York. But what's the next step for you? Will you go on to work in other states on the same issue, Corinne, or take on another health issue in New York? Do you know yet?
I'm trying to live in the moment right now. There have been many times when I've thought, what's next? And this year, with I don't know, the changed tenor of the campaign, the fact that, this could be real, I think it's more important than ever to just sit with this. There's certainly going to be work around implementation. I did that in New Jersey.
Mhm.
But I've always been interested in the issues that, people look at and say, that's crazy until they start to look at the evidence. So, I think that the next issue I work on, if I leave this field, will be another one of those.
Here's a question I should have asked you earlier. I just remembered it now. New York has a law, a court case rather, from 2017, um, Myers versus Schneiderman. You must know that. That's different than other states. It was that a big barrier? Can you talk a little bit about what that was and how you got around that?
Well, there were some groups and some advocates that thought we're never going to pass a medical aid in dying through the legislature. It's too hard in New York.
Right,
The
right.
opposition is too great, and so let's try to get it through a court decision. Montana's medical aid in dying law is through a court decision, and so that was the idea here: is bring a lawsuit on behalf of patients and doctors who want medical aid and want the option of medical aid in dying and see if we can't, vindicate that right through the New York State Constitution. Well, the courts said no. This is an area for the legislature, and so it's not been a barrier so much as it was a strategy that didn't pan out. And in fact, we
Mhm.
had to be in it for the long haul to get it done through the legislature.
Interesting because that is another comparison with abortion, where a health issue gets mixed up with a whole lot of legal and emotional issues.
Right.
Mhm. In both of those cases, yeah. Okay, I want to end with you. I want to give you an opportunity and my listeners the chance to hear about Compassion and Choices, the organization you work for, and a tool they have for people who are not facing terminal illness yet to think about the end of their lives before it is too late. Can you take that away? Just talk a
Yeah.
little bit about it.
Compassion and Choices is a national nonprofit organization, and our goal is to help people chart their own end of life journey. So, we do a number of different things from community education about the importance of advanced care planning to litigating on behalf of families whose loved ones' wishes were not respected at the end of their lives. And we also have an end of life consultation program so that people, no matter where they live in this country, can call our organization and talk to an end of life consultant to help them navigate getting the care that they want. One thing I will point out for your listeners and something that you alluded to earlier is that medical aid in dying is not the solution for everything, right? So Alzheimer's and dementia, someone would not be eligible for medical aid in dying, but there is something that we can all do to plan for the kind of care that we want should we get an Alzheimer's or dementia diagnosis. And we have an online tool that helps people think through the various stages of dementia and what kind of care they would want, including refusing artificial nutrition and hydration. So
Mhm.
it's something that I would encourage people who are thinking about this area to think through and access those tools. And it's never too early to do that, Rosemary. I think a lot of people don't want to talk about death and dying. They don't feel like they're anywhere near that stage. But these issues can confront us at any stage.
Absolutely. You can have an accident tomorrow, and that's not, but I'll tell you, having an elderly parent who is struggling, there's nothing like that to make you aware that, oh, maybe I better take care of this right now.
That's right.
I want to thank Corinne Carey for a really important work and for taking the time out to tell us about it. The show's going to continue after this break. Next, we're going to speak for a little while with Dr. Agape Armides. She has worked with dying patients. She runs some death cafes. We'll ask her about that. And she is a supporter of the bill currently being considered by the legislature. Doctor, can you explain just how you came to be a supporter of this idea, medical aid in dying?
I think starting my medical journey in the field of anesthesia, back in 2009, when I came out of residency training, I would come across people that were dying every day, obviously. And I have just been always a big supporter of patient autonomy at every stage of life. And that has never changed. But when I switched over to hospice and palliative medicine, my specialty in 2021, I saw how much more applicable that became and how much more frequently that was something that we had to address, because it should be an option for patients, because it is their life and it should be their death, in my opinion. It impacts them more than anybody else, having that option to make their lives a little bit less, to make them to suffer less at the end, when there are things that hospice cannot do in some instances to ameliorate their suffering. Hospice is incredible, and it can really help the majority of patients for the majority of their journey towards death. However, there are certain diagnoses and certain types of pain that nothing can touch, nothing legal that we have can touch. And that doesn't necessarily have to be physical pain. It certainly is most of the time, but it can be a combination of physical pain and existential pain, which is total pain. In other words, it's a term we use in hospice, total pain, which is this existential component that patients experience. But mostly it's the suffering that comes from physical pain, as well as loss of autonomy, such as in ALS patients, for example. They're no longer able to swallow, they're no longer able to breathe. And sometimes people just want to avoid that. They want to check out before that happens, because there's no point in living, there's no quality of life at that point. And all that is left are patients that are truly suffering, and their family members who are just there helpless. Nothing, they're not able to do anything to help their loved ones. And, medical aid in dying doesn't hasten anybody's death. It just gives them an option to allow each patient to have a right to say, this is enough. I've had enough. I'm dying. Let me go in peace, and let me go without, unnecessary suffering. There's no reason why we allow certain patients to die in severe pain. There are patients that have required, let's say, nerve blocks for such severe pain that no narcotic or opiate can touch. So they have to have nerve blocks where you literally kill certain nerves in their body so that they no longer feel that pain. And sometimes even those procedures are not effective. And I've had so many patients over the years who have told me, I just want to die. Please let me die. Please give me a little bit more morphine. Let me die. Or, I have had patients that said, I want to go to Vermont. I want to go to Switzerland. I'm trying to move to Oregon, and they're desperate. But nobody's gonna say, "Oh, I'm not suffering, but I want to have this anyway." People
Yeah.
want to live. The will to live is incredible, and
Yeah.
this is not something that we are just nilly-willy just giving to anybody that asks for it. Somebody has to have enough evidence of truly suffering, and two physicians have to look at this patient and say, yes, this patient is truly suffering and they deserve this option.
Doctor, I'm glad I asked that question. You obviously were the right person to ask it of. You've thought about it. I understand that you will be one of those doctors, you are, who can certify someone as truly at the end of life and eligible to have medical aid in dying. I understand that it's difficult to find some doctor to do that sometimes. And certainly in putting this podcast together, I had trouble finding a healthcare professional willing to come on and say, yes, we need this. Why are you different? What do you think the reason for that is?
Well, I've always been different. I've never been afraid to stand up and advocate for patients, regardless of the temperature or the climate of, the profession I was in. I feel that if I don't truly advocate for my patients, what am I doing? Am I really here to work for my patients, or am I here just to say I'm a doctor? So I feel very strongly that we all should have autonomy over our bodies and our lives, and that includes the end of it. And how do we want that to look? And I think the core reason, and I speak about this in my death cafes a lot, and pretty much to anyone who will listen, because I will talk about death and dying every day, is that we are raised in a society that is largely death phobic and death denying. And that is truly the core of why people don't want to talk about it, including the majority of non-hospice physicians.
Wow.
I left anesthesia, for example, and when my colleagues found out that I was going to pursue hospice and palliative medicine, most of them would ask me, why are you doing that? Like,
wow,
guys,
wow. Like that's death is not part of health and healing, right? Doctor, before we leave, can you explain a little bit what a death cafe is?
Sure. Death Cafe is a movement that started in Europe, in the UK. And basically, it's a space, whether it's a physical space or a virtual space, where anyone comes together and people come together to have an agenda-free group-led discussion with a facilitator present about anything that pertains to death and dying, thoughts, feelings, fears. And it's really more like a peer support group, but not a therapy session, because we are not therapists, but we are there to hold space and to share in each other's grief and fears, and to be seen and to hold space for others.
And when you hold these, you get a large response.
Oh, yes. And a lot of people are afraid to come. So I try to make mine as safe as possible and not make people feel obligated to speak and they can just sit and observe. But everyone that has come to my death cafes for the first time has always returned. And it has always been an uplifting and inspiring experience for them. Because the truth is that this is the one truth that binds us all as humans. And everyone is really curious and wants someone to talk to about it, but majority of people don't have someone in their home or in their work life who is willing and capable of holding space for that time.
Right. You're listening to Dr. Agape Armides. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to On the Brink. We're going to continue. I want you to hear now from Assemblyman Al Taylor from Upper Manhattan. He has been in the Assembly for some time, but he has changed his mind about this bill that we are talking about, the medical aid in dying. And I've asked him to explain his change in heart. It follows a societal change in heart. We used to be very much against any kind of interference with death, and people now have changed their mind about that as a whole. Can you tell us about your personal experience, Assemblyman?
Well, first, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to share my thoughts, Rosemary. I believe that first, if you're really open-minded about life in general, there's always room for transformation to do this or do that. But my change of heart came with a personal experience in where my wife and I took care of my dad in his ailing days. So he went from kind of like slow to like it got unbearable. It became unbearable because he suffered from cancer. And nowhere in the journey did I imagine that I would hear my dad pleading with me that he didn't want to live like this. And the first time I heard it, and I said this before, the first time I heard it, I was like, the first thought was, he doesn't really want to cash out here, right? It's just like he's uncomfortable and maybe get some other activities into his life that maybe enhance and brighten his spirit. But no, he was in agitating state. The issue of pain was unbearable.
Right.
And he wanted relief. And I had to get my mind around that in the sense that, okay, here's a healthy person. He's no longer vibrant. He's no longer been able to take care of himself. So those things, you know, you're changing their bed sores and all of. But mind you, while I'm going through this, Rosemary, I'm never thinking about I want to now support medical aid and diet. It didn't cross my mind. The two of those were mutually independent of each other.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say my dad passed away 2 years ago and maybe a month or so to the date. And of this date. And I was passing through the hallways and I always saw the yellow shirts. And the first time I would see them, my first couple of years, I said, don't even think about it. I had conversation and I was very casual, you know, in cordial. I said, hey, yes, thank you very much. I appreciate you sharing. I'm saying when pigs fly, I'm not interested. Because, listen, I am a pastor. I have my faith. I have my own orientation of what that looks like and who's in charge. But I think I had to wrestle with myself just to have a conversation. But after my dad passed, I remember sitting down with 3 folks at the break area outside of Chambers. And they wanted to talk to me about medical aid and that. I was like, yeah. The minute the woman started talking, I was boiling. And I was like, oh. And it was happening, or it had happened to me. I didn't even realize. And I say to people that say, well, you can't do that. Like, listen, people will make their own blessed decision. What I'm saying is people ought to have that option to do it.
Right.
If I were on a farm and I had a racehorse worth $1 million or $2, and that horse went lame, I would put that horse, and legally so, out of his misery by helping him out. Why? So, and I'm not treating people in that manner, but I think we're in a society where things are so rough. And listen, and this is dignity. This is not just like we want to get out of here. We're saying before you get to the point where you're in excruciating pain, you're debilitated, and you can't or fend for yourself, and you know that's on the horizon. All the medical records show that. And if there's a miracle, God will work it out, and you don't have to. And also, I don't mean to bounce around on you, but sometimes the statistics show that, let's say 100 people took it, qualified, and they're in it, maybe 25 exercise that right to do it. So more people are not doing it, even though they have the right and they've gone through it. So this is not a rush to jump off a bridge, and people can do it as well. We're saying give people the opportunity, and here's the dignity. We want to be able to say, hey, I want to sit down with my loved ones, those that are special to me, and say, hey, listen, I'm on this journey, and I just want you to honor this and help me, and vice versa. And the other part of that is, if that's not on the table, what are the other options? Jumping in front of a New York subway off of something horrific, and you're trying to put your mind around what happened to my loved one. And we're saying, here's an opportunity. If you meet all the criteria, 2 medical doctors that are qualified, they're not coming in some foreign place, and they're not mail order doctors. These are licensed bond doctors in the state of New York that will give an earnest opinion. And they can have more than 2 doctors' opinions if they want, but a minimum of 2. And then we have to make sure that their mental state is fine. So if we need to do that, they can qualify and show that this person. The same thing if you want to contest the will, was that person in their right state of mind when they did this? Same thing. So you make sure those things are there. And I mean, I heard questions that, well, what do we do with the medicine if they don't take the medicine? Listen, we've distributed so much drugs in America. Did somebody be familiar with something called opioid? Right? I mean, get this Oxycontin thing at home, and there are pills all over the place, and we have Earth Day to make sure you don't flush your stuff. So don't hit me over the head, tell me, oh, we got to worry about these medicines and out of control. We have a problem in America, and that's not one of them in this bill right here. We're saying that you have a right. HIPAA provides you with a rule, a law that says no one but you and your doctor can talk about this unless you give them permission to do otherwise. And I just think it makes good sense. And if my dad would have come to me and said, this is what I want, I probably had a harder time, but I would have to wrap my mind around and say, okay, Pops, this is what you want. And, maybe I have to go out and have a beer and come back because he's telling me farewell. And how many times have people left and not have an opportunity to have real closure? And I think this is a dignified way to do it if people choose to do it. And we're not like any other place in the state of New York or Canada, because Canada has an assisted piece to it. The individual here must be able to do this themselves.
It's not a suicide.
It is not working. No, you must be able to do this yourself. And we're saying, here's an opportunity if you want. And hey, people say, well, I believe in a higher power. I do too. I said, listen, let God be my judge in this space right here. But the people that I've met in this journey, from my dad, and whether he qualified or not, I don't know. But I think it should be an option on the table to be considered. And I've met some people along this journey in the last 2 years that are not here. And they suffered on the way out. And we're saying, if we can make a difference in the quality of your living as well as the quality and how you're going to leave this place, then let us do that. So there's dignity. That's all we're trying to do here. And yes, I'm proud to be able to say, like, hey, you grow, you learn. And if you're not learning anything in life and you're rigid in where you're at, then you're not growing for sure.
Do you predict the bill will make it? It's already gone through the assembly. You've done your part.
No, I don't think I've completed my part until we get it to the governor's desk. And because there are a lot of people that were in that chamber that like myself, I don't know, some of them stories like, hey, I don't want this to happen, or I have a story, or I know of a story, and people sign their name to this because they believe it. I'm believing that it will get through, and it's in you. Even this conversation that we're having right now is an opportunity. And if you're listening to this and you're in the state of New York and you know who your senators are, let them know that this is something that you support. And if you do, give them a call, shoot them an email. They want to be the voice of the people. And every now and then you have to step out on faith.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this.
Appreciate your time. Anytime. Have a blessed day. And thank you for allowing me to participate.
Thank you, Assemblyman Taylor. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
As most of you know, we like to end our chapters of On the Brink with a toast. And Generally, these are intended to salute the good in people and in the world, if we can find it, and to urge us to do better. This week's toast is to death with dignity. I think the speakers this week have made it clear that this is not just one thing. There's not just one way to leave the world. It's about having the choice to leave in the way that you want. It may be doing nothing and just let happen whatever the fates decree. Or it might mean choosing the time and place to end your life, cutting short pointless suffering. That's the point of the legislation that New York is now considering. Or it might even be the way of Pope John Paul II, who I looked up to. He bravely turned his visible suffering from Parkinson into a months-long act of love and sacrifice. And as I said, a show of bravery. The end of our lives is momentous, and we should be in control of it, not the government. And to that idea, I raise my glass.